use of words and phrases, Claire. So one that I remember, and you do talk about, reasonable worst case scenario. What the heck is a reasonable worst case scenario?
I think that is just such a fundamental question, because that phrase, it's such a fundamental question because that phrase is what got us into so much trouble back in 2009 with the swine flu pandemic, where the modelers were using reasonable in a way that no reasonable person ever would. So they would use reasonable worst case scenario to mean the most extreme worst case scenario that was very unlikely to happen. Literally, that's the way they were using the term reasonable. And obviously nobody heard that. They heard reasonable. And so they were taking on board extreme, very, very unlikely predictions as if that was something we should be, acting around and causing immense harm. And so after that swine flu pandemic, Dame Deirdre Hine did a government report on the problems around it and the mistakes that were made and what lessons should be learned. And in that she included that phrase as being really important, that it mustn't be used in that way anymore, that it has to be communicated more clearly. And likewise, the European Centre for Disease Control did their own report, and they also came up with the importance of not using that phrase. Guess what? That lesson wasn't learnt, and they're still using it today. And they're using it to mean a sort of 1 in 20,000 year type event, literally things that will not happen, things that don't happen. And you should not be briefing politicians about things that won't happen. And what's extraordinary, of course, is that their reasonable worst case scenario back in spring 2020 of 500,000 deaths is something that they're still defending to this day.
Unbelievable,
yeah. It is unbelievable. And it's kind of the psychology of that I find really fascinating, that Neil Ferguson and Dominic Cummings, they're still talking about it as if that is what would have happened.
What would have happened.
And it's almost as if, when they articulated it back in spring 2020, and they sort of put their name to it. They said, right, this is why we're doing this. This is what the risk is. Having done that and sort of, it's become part of their identity, that number.
This would have happened if we aren't so clever and intervened and saved all your lives. Be grateful.
Yeah, well, that's exactly what Matt Hancock's still saying.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Hancock. Thank you so much.
What he'll say is, just because it didn't happen doesn't mean it wouldn't have happened, and it's thanks to all the things we did that it didn't happen. And so I think there comes a point where you've said things in public and acted on them, even way more minor things than what Matt Hancock did, where it becomes very hard to say that was wrong and I should have done this.
Well, it's very hard to prove the negative. It's hard to disprove what he's saying. I mean, I'm incapable of saying. Proving there is no Loch Ness monster. It's very hard to prove a negative anyway. So, right, bless him.